The sterile white walls of training facility Omega-7 had witnessed countless demonstrations of alien superiority over the years. Towering Krillian warriors with their chitinous exoskeletons had shattered reinforced combat dummies. Ethereal Vashti telepaths had manipulated gravity fields with mere thoughts. The crystalline Zephyrians had channeled stellar energy through their translucent bodies, creating light shows that left observers temporarily blinded. Yet on this particular morning, something unprecedented was about to unfold. Something that would fundamentally alter every species' understanding of human potential. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood at the center of the observation deck, her small frame dwarfed by the assembled alien dignitaries, military commanders, and academy instructors. At barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing perhaps 120 pounds, she appeared almost fragile compared to the imposing figures surrounding her. Her Regulation Academy uniform hung loosely on her slight build, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that swayed gently as she moved. To the untrained eye, she looked like nothing more than another human cadet. Unremarkable, weak, and certainly not worthy of the attention she was receiving. The gathered assembly represented the finest military minds from across the galaxy. General Thurok of the Mandorian Empire stood near the observation window, his massive frame casting shadows across the deck. His species had conquered 17 star systems through brute force alone, their warriors capable of crushing steel with their bare hands. Beside him, Admiral Nexus of the Cerebral Collective floated in her containment sphere, her enlarged cranium pulsing with psychic energy that could level city blocks. The reptilian commander Eskastar hissed softly, his forked tongue testing the air for signs of deception or fear. Each of these beings had achieved their positions through demonstrations of overwhelming power, and none had ever encountered a human who posed even the slightest threat to their dominance. The training deck below stretched out like a vast arena, its reinforced composite flooring designed to withstand the most extreme combat scenarios. The walls were lined with energy absorbers capable of dissipating weapon blasts equivalent to ship-to-ship bombardments. Overhead, a network of force field generators hummed quietly, ready to contain any explosion or energy discharge that might threaten the observers. The facility had been constructed using materials harvested from collapsed neutron stars, compressed and refined through processes that required the combined technological might of 7 different species. It was, by any measure, one of the most durable structures ever created. Sarah had requested this demonstration 3 weeks earlier, following a series of incidents that had caught the attention of the Academy's leadership. During routine combat assessments, she had consistently outperformed expectations, but never in ways that seemed to rely on raw physical strength or advanced technology. Her victories were subtle, almost accidental-looking, yet devastatingly effective. When sparring with Krillian cadets twice her size, she would somehow find the exact pressure point that would cause their exoskeletons to crack. Against Vashti telepaths, she would maintain a mental discipline that proved impervious to their psychic intrusions, then counter with strategies they never saw coming. Her instructors had begun to take notice, but it wasn't until she had defeated an entire squad of elite alien warriors in a single engagement that the higher-ups demanded a formal evaluation. The laughter had started the moment she entered the facility that morning. It began as subtle chuckles from the back rows of observers, spreading like a contagion through the assembled crowd. The Mandorians grunted with amusement, their deep voices creating a rumbling undertone that seemed to shake the observation deck. The Cerebral Collective representatives shared telepathic jokes, their mental communications manifesting as brief flashes of light around their containment spheres. Even the normally stoic Zephyrians allowed their crystalline forms to pulse with colors that indicated mild entertainment. This is what the humans consider their finest warrior? General Thurok's voice boomed across the deck, his words translated by the Universal Communication System into a dozen different languages. I have seen their kind before. They break like twigs in a strong wind. Admiral Nexus's telepathic voice resonated in the minds of everyone present, carrying with it an undertone of condescending amusement. Perhaps this is some sort of jest. Surely they cannot expect us to believe that such a fragile creature poses any sort of challenge. Commander Skastar's serpentine features twisted into what might have been a smile. Human delusions know no bounds. They persist in believing they can compete with their betters despite all evidence to the contrary. The Academy's own staff seemed equally skeptical. Instructor Valnos, a battle-scarred veteran of the Proxima Wars, shook his massive head in disbelief. His species, the Gornathi, were known throughout the galaxy for their practical approach to warfare, and he had little patience for what appeared to be an elaborate waste of time. In all my centuries of training warriors, I have never encountered a human who possessed anything approaching true combat capability. They rely entirely on technology and numbers to compensate for their natural weakness. Dr. Kefara, the Academy's chief medical officer and a renowned xenobiologist, had been studying human physiology for decades. Her clinical assessments had consistently shown humans to be among the most fragile sentient species in the galaxy. Their bone density was laughably low compared to most spacefaring races. Their muscle fibers lacked the efficiency of Krillian biomechanics. Their neural processing speed seemed glacial when measured against cerebral collective standards. From a purely scientific perspective, she announced to her colleagues, humans represent an evolutionary dead end. They lack the physical attributes necessary for survival in a hostile universe. The mockery continued for several minutes, each species contributing their own observations about human inadequacy. Stories were shared of human colonies that had fallen to simple natural disasters, of human fleets that had been decimated by opponents a fraction of their size, of human warriors who had fled from battles that any other species would have won easily. The consensus was clear. Humanity was tolerated in the galactic community only because of their technological contributions and their usefulness as a client species. As warriors, they were beneath consideration. Sarah stood in the center of this verbal assault with perfect composure, her expression never changing, her posture remaining relaxed and confident. She had heard variations of these same insults throughout her entire career. At the academy, human cadets were routinely assigned to support roles, considered unsuitable for frontline combat positions. In joint exercises, they were typically relegated to logistical duties or technical support, their alien commanders assuming they would be liabilities in actual battle. She had learned long ago that words could not diminish her, that the opinions of others held no power over her true capabilities. But those who laughed did not understand what they were witnessing. They saw only the surface, a small human woman in an ill-fitting uniform, standing alone against the accumulated might of the galaxy's greatest military powers. They failed to recognize the subtle signs that marked Sarah as something entirely different from their preconceptions. Her breathing was perfectly controlled, each inhalation and exhalation timed with mathematical precision. Her stance appeared casual, but every muscle in her body was positioned for optimal response to any threat. Her eyes, dark and seemingly unremarkable, moved constantly, cataloging every detail of her surroundings with the efficiency of the most advanced targeting computers. The demonstration was scheduled to begin with a simple strength test. The Academy's standard protocol required candidates to lift a standardized weight, approximately 2,000 pounds in Earth gravity, and hold it for 30 seconds. This represented the minimum physical requirement for admission to advanced combat training. Most alien species completed this task effortlessly. Krillians could typically manage 5 times the required weight. Mandorians often used one hand, treating the exercise as a form of light stretching. Even the telepathic cerebral collective could achieve the required lift through pure psychokinetic force. The weight materialized in the center of the training deck, constructed from compressed dark matter and contained within a stabilization field. It was a perfect cube, each side measuring exactly 2 feet, its surface reflecting the overhead lighting with mirror-like precision. The gravitational distortion it created was visible as a slight warping of space around its edges, and the deck plates beneath it had been reinforced with additional structural supports to prevent damage to the facility's foundation. Sarah walked toward the weight with unhurried steps, her movements so smooth they seemed almost choreographed. The laughter from the observation deck grew louder as the assembled dignitaries anticipated her inevitable failure. General Thurrock leaned forward, eager to witness the moment when human pretensions would collapse under the weight of reality. Admiral Nexus began recording the event for later analysis and entertainment. Commander Skartar's forked tongue flicked out repeatedly, as if he could taste the approaching humiliation. "Perhaps we should have prepared a lighter weight," Instructor Velnos commented, his voice carrying clearly across the deck. "Something more appropriate for human limitations. Or perhaps a cushioned landing area," added Dr. Kethara. "When she inevitably collapses under the strain, we wouldn't want her to injure herself too severely." The mockery reached its crescendo as Sarah reached the weight and crouched beside it. Her small hands positioned themselves on opposite sides of the cube, her fingers finding purchase on surfaces that appeared perfectly smooth. She took 3 deep breaths each, one seeming to draw energy from somewhere deep within her core. The observers fell silent for a moment, anticipating the spectacle of her failure. Then she stood up. The weight rose with her, as if it were made of paper rather than compressed matter. There was no strain visible in her posture, no trembling in her muscles, no sign that she was exerting any effort whatsoever. She held the 2,000-pound mass above her head with one hand, her other arm hanging casually at her side. The 30-second requirement passed without notice. A full minute elapsed. Then, too, the silence in the observation deck was now complete, the earlier laughter dying away as the assembled aliens struggled to process what they were witnessing. "Gravitational manipulation," whispered one of the cerebral collective observers. "She must be using some form of technological assistance." Dr. Kethara's instruments detected no artificial energy fields, no technological augmentation, no external assistance of any kind. The readings were impossible to reconcile with everything she knew about human physiology. According to her scans, Sarah was operating within completely normal human parameters, yet achieving results that should have been physically impossible. But this was only the beginning. Sarah set the weight down with the same casual ease she had demonstrated while lifting it. The cube settled onto the deck with a soft thud that barely registered on the facility's sensors despite its massive density. She turned to face the observation deck, her expression still perfectly neutral, and spoke for the first time since entering the facility. "I believe the next test involves combat simulation," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the communication system. "Shall we proceed?" The combat simulation was the Academy's most advanced training system, capable of creating holographic opponents that could match the capabilities of any known warrior species. The scenarios ranged from single combat duels to massive battlefield engagements, with difficulty levels that had been calibrated based on decades of data from the galaxy's finest military academies. The highest settings were considered suitable only for veteran warriors with years of combat experience. Most cadets required months of preparation before attempting even the intermediate levels. Commander Gis, who had been silent throughout the strength demonstration, finally stepped forward. As the Academy's senior tactical instructor, he had personally designed many of the combat scenarios. His own species, the Valkyrie, were renowned throughout the galaxy for their strategic brilliance, and he had spent the better part of a century studying the art of warfare. If anyone could devise a test that would reveal the true extent of Sarah's abilities, or lack thereof, it was him. "The standard protocol begins with level 5 scenarios," he announced, his synthetic voice modulated to convey professional authority. "However, given the unusual nature of this demonstration, I propose we begin with level 1. The suggestion drew renewed chuckles from the observation deck. Level 1 scenarios were typically used for basic instruction, featuring opponents with reduced capabilities and predictable attack patterns. They were designed to build confidence in new cadets, not to test the abilities of someone claiming to be humanity's finest warrior. Sarah nodded her acceptance without protest. "Level 1 will be sufficient to begin," she replied. The holographic projectors activated, filling the training deck with a shimmering grid of light. Within seconds, the empty space had been transformed into a rocky canyon environment, complete with realistic terrain features, atmospheric effects, and environmental hazards. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Individual grains of sand were visible in the artificial sunlight, and a gentle breeze seemed to stir the holographic vegetation that dotted the landscape. Her opponents materialized moments later, 3 Krillian warriors in basic combat armor, armed with standard energy weapons and melee implements. They were exact replicas of real soldiers, their movements and tactics based on extensive battlefield recordings. Even in this reduced difficulty scenario, they represented formidable opponents capable of defeating most organic warriors through sheer physical superiority. The engagement began immediately. The lead Krillian charged forward, its massive form thundering across the rocky ground with surprising speed. Its companions flanked left and right, seeking to surround their apparently helpless human opponent. Energy beams lanced out from their weapons, creating brilliant streaks of light that should have reduced any organic target to smoking ash. Sarah moved. Her body seemed to flow like liquid mercury, each motion perfectly timed and impossibly precise. She wasn't faster than her opponents in any conventional sense. Detailed analysis would later show that her actual velocity never exceeded normal human limits. Instead, she was simply in the right place at exactly the right moment, every time. Energy beams passed through empty space where she had been standing microseconds earlier. Melee attacks struck nothing but air as she seemed to anticipate her opponent's moves with supernatural accuracy. The first Krillian fell within 15 seconds, its artificial consciousness terminating as Sarah's seemingly gentle touch found the exact point where its exoskeleton connected to its neural interface. The second lasted slightly longer, managing to fire 3 shots before Sarah's hand brushed against its weapon, causing the energy cell to overload and explode. The third opponent attempted to retreat, recognizing the futility of continuing the engagement, but Sarah was already moving, her approach so smooth and inevitable that resistance seemed pointless. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. 3 veteran Krillian warriors, even holographic ones, had been neutralized by a human woman who appeared to have exerted no more effort than someone might use while taking a leisurely walk. The observation deck remained silent. General Thurok's massive hands gripped the railings so tightly that the reinforced metal began to deform. Admiral Nexus had ceased all telepathic communication, her enlarged brain working frantically to process the impossible data she had just witnessed. Commander Skartar's tongue had stopped its constant movement, frozen in mid-flick as his reptilian mind struggled to comprehend what he had seen. Level 2, Sarah announced, her breathing still perfectly controlled. The holographic environment shifted, becoming more complex. The canyon was replaced by an urban battleground, complete with multi-story buildings, vehicle obstacles, and environmental hazards. Her new opponents were a mixed unit: 2 Mandorian shock troopers, a cerebral collective psyker, and a Zephyrian energy manipulator. This scenario was typically used to test advanced cadets who had completed months of specialized training. The results were even more decisive than the first engagement. The Mandorians, despite their enhanced strength and tactical coordination, found themselves unable to land a single blow. The cerebral collective psyker's mental attacks seemed to slide off Sarah's consciousness like water off glass, while her physical response bypassed the creature's psychic defenses entirely. The Zephyrian's energy projections, capable of melting through ship armor, were somehow redirected harmlessly into the ground. Level 3, Sarah said, and the environment changed again. Then, Level 4. Level 5. Each scenario brought increasingly sophisticated opponents, more complex tactical situations, and deadlier environmental hazards. Sarah progressed through them with the same methodical precision, never seeming hurried, never appearing to struggle. By level 7, she was facing opponents that would challenge veteran warriors with decades of combat experience. By level 10, the scenarios were considered suitable only for the galaxy's most elite special forces units. The observation deck had become a study in stunned silence. Species that had dominated galactic warfare for millennia watched in growing disbelief as their most cherished assumptions about combat effectiveness crumbled before their eyes. Cathara's instruments continued to register impossible readings. Sarah's vital signs remained within normal human ranges, showing no evidence of the superhuman capability she was clearly demonstrating. "This is not possible," General Thurok finally whispered, his voice barely audible through the communication system. "Humans do not possess these abilities. They cannot possess these abilities." Commander Zis had been reviewing the sensor data throughout the demonstration, searching for any evidence of technological assistance or hidden augmentation. His analysis revealed nothing. No energy fields, no cybernetic implants, no external enhancement of any kind. According to every instrument at his disposal, Sarah was operating as a completely baseline human, yet achieving results that surpassed the finest warriors from across the galaxy. "Level 15, Sarah announced. A collective gasp arose from the observation deck. Level 15 scenarios were theoretical constructs, designed to test the absolute limits of what was considered militarily possible. They featured opponents whose capabilities exceeded those of any known species, environmental hazards that could challenge entire fleets, and tactical situations that required strategic thinking on a planetary scale. No individual had ever successfully completed a Level 15 scenario. It was generally considered an insurmountable challenge, included in the system more as a calibration standard than as an actual test. The holographic environment that materialized was unlike anything the observers had seen before. It appeared to be the interior of a massive space station, with multiple levels connected by gravity lifts and force bridges. The artificial atmosphere crackled with exotic energy fields, and the structural support seemed to be composed of materials that defied conventional physics. Emergency klaxons wailed in the distance, and warning lights bathed everything in an ominous red glow. Sarah's opponents were nightmarish constructs, beings of pure energy and exotic matter that moved with impossible speed and struck with planet-cracking force. There were dozens of them, appearing simultaneously from multiple directions, their attacks coordinated with superhuman precision. Conventional wisdom held that no organic being could survive more than seconds in such an environment, regardless of their species or training. Sarah not only survived, she thrived. Her movements became something approaching artistry, each gesture flowing seamlessly into the next as she navigated through the chaos with impossible grace. She seemed to understand the fundamental nature of her enemies in ways that their creators had never intended, finding weaknesses and exploiting vulnerabilities that existed only in the deepest levels of their programming. Energy beings that could reshape matter with a thought found their attacks redirected against their allies. Exotic matter constructs that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously discovered that Sarah could somehow predict their movements across all possible realities. The engagement lasted for over an hour, an unprecedented duration for any level 15 scenario. When it finally ended, the holographic environment dissolved, to reveal Sarah standing alone in the center of the training deck, her uniform slightly rumpled, but otherwise showing no signs of the epic battle she had just fought. The silence in the observation deck was absolute. Centuries of military doctrine, strategic planning, and tactical assessment had been rendered obsolete in the space of a single demonstration. Every assumption about human capabilities had been shattered. Every dismissive comment about their weakness now seeming not just wrong, but dangerously naive. It was Admiral Nexus who finally broke the silence, her telepathic voice carrying an undertone of something approaching fear. "What are you?" Sarah looked up at the observation deck, her dark eyes seeming to focus on each observer in turn. When she spoke, her voice was calm and measured, carrying a weight of certainty that none of them had expected. "I am what humanity becomes when it stops accepting limitations imposed by others," she said. "I am what emerges when we realize that strength is not measured in muscle mass or psychic power, but in the absolute refusal to be conquered by anything." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Every species in this room has achieved greatness through some form of natural advantage. You, General Thurrock, conquered worlds through brute force. Admiral Nexus, your people dominate through mental superiority. Commander Scarta, your species survived by being more ruthless than your enemies. But humans, we had no natural advantages. We were weak, slow, fragile creatures on a hostile world, surrounded by predators that could kill us with ease." Her voice gained intensity, though her expression remained perfectly controlled. "Do you know what that taught us? It taught us that survival is not about being the strongest or the fastest or the most psychically gifted. It taught us that survival is about adaptation, about finding ways to overcome impossible odds through sheer determination and refusal to accept defeat. It taught us that the greatest enemy we would ever face was not some external threat, but our own limitations, and that those limitations exist only as long as we choose to accept them." The assembled aliens listened with growing unease as Sarah continued her explanation. "You see weakness when you look at humanity, because you expect us to compete on your terms, using your definitions of strength. But we learned long ago that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Every human who has ever achieved anything significant has had to overcome not just external obstacles, but their own internal barriers, their own accepted limitations, their own comfortable assumptions about what is possible." She began walking toward the observation deck, her movements as controlled and precise as they had been throughout the combat scenarios. "I am not stronger than a Mandorian warrior, but I have learned to apply force more efficiently than they thought possible. I am not faster than a Zephyrian energy being, but I have learned to be in the right place at the right time, with precision that makes speed irrelevant. I am not more psychically gifted than the cerebral collective, but I have trained my mind to function at levels that make their advantages meaningless." The force field separating the training deck from the observation area hummed softly as Sarah approached, a barrier designed to contain even the most powerful energy discharges. She placed her hand against it, her palm flat against the shimmering surface. "This barrier represents everything you believe about human limitations. You think it protects you from us, that it maintains the proper separation between the weak and the strong. But barriers only have power over those who choose to accept them." She pressed slightly harder against the force field, and impossible cracks began to appear in the energy matrix. The barrier had been designed to withstand direct hits from ship-mounted weapons, yet it was failing under the gentle pressure of a human hand. Alarm klaxons began sounding throughout the facility. as safety systems registered massive energy fluctuations. The training deck was built to contain the mightiest warriors from across the galaxy, Sarah continued, her voice remaining calm even as the structural supports around them began to groan under impossible stress. Its designers assumed they understood the upper limits of what any individual could achieve. They calculated load tolerances based on the known capabilities of every spacefaring species. But they made one critical error. They assumed that those capabilities represented absolute limits rather than merely accepted ones. The cracks in the force field were spreading now, branching out like a spiderweb across the entire barrier. The energy discharge was beginning to affect the facility's primary systems, causing lights to flicker and artificial gravity to fluctuate. Emergency protocols activated throughout the station as sensors detected power surges that exceeded all safety parameters. General Thurok stepped back from the observation window, his massive frame trembling with something that might have been fear. "This is impossible," he whispered. "No individual possesses this kind of power. The physical laws of the universe do not permit." "The physical laws of the universe," Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through his protest with absolute certainty, "are far more flexible than you have chosen to believe. You have spent so long accepting what is possible that you never learned to explore what might be possible. You became comfortable with your strength, satisfied with your limitations, content to rule over others rather than to rule over yourselves." The force field collapsed entirely, its energy matrix dissolving into harmless light that scattered across the deck like falling stars. Sarah stepped through the space where it had been, her movement as casual as walking through an open door. The assembled aliens backed away instinctively, their centuries of tactical training suddenly seeming woefully inadequate. But Sarah had no intention of harming anyone. Instead, she moved to the center of the observation deck and turned to face them all, her expression still perfectly calm. "I did not come here to threaten you, or to prove human superiority. I came here to demonstrate a fundamental truth that every species eventually must learn. The greatest enemy you will ever face is your own accepted limitations." Cathara, her scientific mind still struggling to process the data she had collected, found her voice. "Your physiological readings remained within normal human parameters throughout the entire demonstration. According to every instrument we possess, you accomplished the impossible while operating as a completely baseline human. How is such a thing possible?" Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the facility, her expression transforming from neutral competence to something approaching warmth. "Because baseline human represents something none of you have ever understood. You see our physical limitations and assume they define us. You measure our capabilities against your own and find us wanting. But you fail to recognize what humanity truly is. A species that has spent its entire evolutionary history learning to exceed its own limitations." She gestured toward the damaged remains of the training facility around them. "Every human achievement, from our first steps out of the caves to our expansion across the stars, required us to overcome something that should have been impossible. We learned to fly without wings, to swim without gills, to survive in environments that should have killed us, to think thoughts that should have been beyond our mental capacity. We became the only species in known space that routinely accomplishes things we are not naturally equipped to do." Commander Scar's reptilian features twisted with confusion. "But the limitations are real. Physical laws cannot be ignored. Genetic capabilities cannot be exceeded." "Cannot?" Sarah's voice carried a note of gentle challenge. "Or simply have not been by those who chose to accept those boundaries as permanent? Tell me, Commander, when your species first achieved spaceflight, did you redesign your bodies to survive in vacuum? Or did you learn to build ships that allowed you to exceed your natural limitations?" The commander's forked tongue flicked out nervously as he considered her words. Like most spacefaring species, the Skitarii had achieved their expansion through technology that compensated for their biological limitations. They had never attempted to exceed those limitations directly. "The difference," Sarah continued, "is that most species use technology to work around their limitations. Humans learn to transform our limitations into advantages. Every human child is taught that obstacles exist to be overcome, that failures are learning opportunities, that the word impossible is simply an invitation to find a better way. We raised entire generations with the fundamental belief that any barrier can be broken if you understand it well enough and are willing to pay the price to break it." Admiral Nexus's telepathic voice resonated with dawning comprehension. "The training, it was never about developing superhuman abilities. It was about eliminating self-imposed restrictions.
Exactly, Sarah confirmed.
I am not stronger than baseline human. I simply no longer accept the arbitrary limitations that most humans place on their own strength. I am not faster than baseline human. I no longer waste energy on inefficient movements or hesitation. I am not more intelligent than baseline human. I simply learned to use my full mental capacity instead of the small fraction that most people access. She looked around at the assembled aliens, her gaze taking in their expressions of confusion, fear, and dawning understanding. This is what humanity offers to the galaxy. Not another warrior species to add to your collections, but a completely different approach to the concept of limitation itself. We can teach you that the barriers you accept as permanent are often nothing more than comfortable assumptions. We can show you that the greatest victories are not won against external enemies, but against the small, quiet voice inside yourself that whispers, "This is impossible." The training deck beneath their feet began to show signs of structural stress, hairline cracks appearing in the supposedly indestructible composite material. The damage was not from any direct attack, but from the residual energy effects of Sarah's earlier demonstrations. The facility's designers had never imagined that the laws of physics themselves might prove more flexible than their calculations had assumed. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, Sarah repeated, her words carrying a weight of absolute certainty. This is not just a human philosophy. It is a universal truth that applies to every sentient being. You cannot be conquered by any external force until you first surrender to your own limitations. You cannot be defeated by any enemy until you first accept that defeat is inevitable. As if to emphasize her point, the deck plates beneath her feet began to buckle and warp, stress fractures spreading outward in complex geometric patterns. The facility's emergency systems were screaming warnings about imminent structural failure, but Sarah seemed completely unconcerned by the growing chaos around her. "I could demonstrate further," she said, her voice cutting through the cacophony of alarms and emergency announcements. "I could show you levels of capability that would shatter every remaining assumption you hold about what is possible. But I believe the point has been made. The question now is whether you will choose to learn from this demonstration or simply dismiss it as an anomaly that threatens your comfortable worldview." General Thurok found his voice, though it trembled with suppressed emotion. "If humans possess capabilities like yours, why have they allowed themselves to be treated as a minor species? Why accept subordinate positions in the galactic hierarchy?" Sarah's smile widened slightly. "Because true strength is not about domination or hierarchy. The human who has destroyed his weak self has no need to prove his superiority to others. He has already achieved the only victory that truly matters. We allow ourselves to be underestimated because it serves our purposes, and because we have learned that the greatest teachers often appear to be the weakest students." The structural damage to the training deck was approaching critical levels now, the supposedly indestructible surface beginning to develop gaps that revealed the underlying support framework. Emergency force fields activated throughout the facility as automated systems attempted to prevent a catastrophic collapse, but even these were showing signs of strain under the impossible energies Sarah had generated. "But make no mistake," she continued, her tone still conversational despite the chaos surrounding them. "The fact that we choose restraint does not mean we are weak. The fact that we prefer cooperation to conquest does not mean we cannot defend ourselves. Every human you have dismissed as inferior possesses the same fundamental capability I have demonstrated here today, the ability to exceed their own limitations through will and understanding." Commander Gis, who had remained silent throughout most of the demonstration, finally stepped forward. His analytical mind had been working frantically to process the implications of what he had witnessed, and his conclusions were both fascinating and terrifying. "You speak of this as if it were a teachable skill rather than a unique gift. Are you suggesting that any human could achieve what you have demonstrated?" "Any human," Sarah confirmed without hesitation. "Any member of any species for that matter, though the specific techniques might vary based on physiological and psychological differences. The fundamental principle remains the same. Limitations exist primarily in the mind, and what the mind accepts as permanent restrictions can be dissolved through proper understanding and sufficient will." She turned to face the observation windows, which were beginning to show stress fractures from the facility's structural instability. Beyond them, the stars wheeled slowly in their eternal dance, indifferent to the small dramas playing out in this remote corner of space. "The choice before you now is simple. You can continue to believe that strength is measured in muscle mass and energy output, that intelligence is measured in processing speed and memory capacity, that success is measured in territory conquered and enemies defeated. Or you can begin to explore the possibility that all of these measurements are arbitrary limitations imposed by minds that have grown comfortable with accepted boundaries. The deck plate directly beneath Sarah's feet chose that moment to give way entirely, stress fractures suddenly expanding into a gaping hole that revealed the facility's lower levels. She should have fallen through the opening, should have been caught off guard by the sudden structural failure. Instead, she simply took a single step backward, her movement so perfectly timed and positioned that she seemed to have anticipated the collapse by several seconds. "The training deck is failing," she observed with mild interest, as if commenting on the weather rather than a catastrophic system breakdown. The designers built it to withstand any conceivable attack, but they never considered that the greatest force acting upon it might be the sudden absence of accepted limitations. The implications of her words were staggering. She was suggesting that her demonstrations had not involved supernatural powers or hidden technologies, but simply the application of normal human capabilities freed from artificial restrictions. The training deck was failing not because she had attacked it, but because the reality of her achievements was incompatible with the assumptions upon which it had been built. Dr. Orr, Kathara's medical scanners were registering readings that defied all known science. According to her instruments, Sarah's cellular structure was operating at efficiency levels that exceeded theoretical maximums. Her neural pathways were processing information at speeds that should have been impossible given the physical limitations of organic tissue. Her muscular system was generating force through mechanisms that her equipment could not identify or measure. "Your readings are impossible," the doctor whispered, her scientific worldview crumbling under the weight of contradictory data. "Only if you assume that your instruments are measuring maximum capabilities rather than commonly achieved ones," Sarah replied. "Your scanners were calibrated based on observations of beings who had accepted their limitations as permanent features. They were never designed to measure the capabilities of someone who had learned to exceed those boundaries." The facility's emergency evacuation protocols, activated as structural integrity continued to deteriorate. Automated systems began herding the observers toward emergency exits, their safety subroutines triggered by damage levels that exceeded all programmed parameters. But none of the assembled aliens moved. They remained transfixed by Sarah's presence, by the implications of her words, by the sight of their most fundamental assumptions dissolving before their eyes. "I will leave you now," Sarah announced, her voice carrying clearly over the facility's emergency announcements. "Not because I fear the collapse of this structure, but because I have accomplished what I came here to do. You have seen what becomes possible when an individual refuses to accept arbitrary limitations. The question of what you do with this knowledge is yours to answer." She began walking toward the main exit, her steps as measured and confident as they had been throughout the entire demonstration. The deck plates cracked and buckled beneath her feet, but she never seemed to be standing on the sections that failed. Her path took her around falling debris and collapsing support structures with an ease that suggested she could perceive structural weak points seconds before they became critical. "Wait," General Thurrock called out, his massive form struggling to process what he had witnessed. "If what you say is true, if these capabilities can be developed by anyone, then you have just rendered every military force in the galaxy obsolete. Wars that have raged for centuries, strategic balances that have maintained peace for millennia, all of it becomes meaningless if individuals can achieve this level of capability." Sarah paused at the exit and turned back to face him. Wars become meaningless when the participants realize that the greatest victory is the conquest of their own limitations. Strategic balances become irrelevant when every individual possesses the capability to exceed previously accepted boundaries. What you see as the destruction of existing order, I see as the beginning of something far greater. The training deck finally reached the point of complete structural failure. What had begun as hairline cracks had expanded into a network of massive fractures that compromised the facility's entire load-bearing structure. The deck split completely in half with a sound like thunder, the two sections tilting away from each other as their support systems failed catastrophically. The assembled observers were forced to retreat to emergency positions as debris began falling from the ceiling and artificial gravity fluctuated wildly. Emergency force fields sparked and failed as the facility's power grid overloaded. What had been one of the most secure and durable structures in known space was rapidly becoming an expanding field of wreckage. Through it all, Sarah continued walking calmly toward the exit, her path taking her across gaps that should have been unbridgeable and around obstacles that should have been impassable. She moved with the confidence of someone who understood that physical barriers were simply problems waiting to be solved. rather than absolute limitations on what was possible. "Remember this moment," she called back to the observers as she reached the safety of the corridor beyond. "Remember that you have seen the arbitrary nature of accepted limitations exposed. Remember that strength, speed, intelligence, and capability are not fixed attributes but variable states dependent on the boundaries you choose to accept." Her final words echoed through the collapsing facility as the last of the structural supports gave way. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has already achieved the only victory that truly matters. The question now is whether you will choose to be destroyed by your own limitations or whether you will learn to destroy them instead. And then she was gone, disappearing into the corridors systems that honeycombed the massive space station. The aliens she left behind stood amid the wreckage of their assumptions, surrounded by the physical debris of a facility that had represented the pinnacle of defensive architecture. The training deck that had been designed to test the limits of what any individual could achieve had been reduced to twisted metal and shattered composite materials by the simple presence of someone who refused to acknowledge those limits as permanent. In the days that followed, the incident report would be classified at the highest levels and distributed only to the most senior military commanders across the galaxy. The implications were too dangerous for general knowledge. The idea that accepted limitations might be arbitrary constructs rather than physical laws threatened the foundation of every existing power structure. Some species began secret research programs, attempting to duplicate Sarah's achievements through technological enhancement or genetic modification. These efforts would universally fail, because they were based on the assumption that her capabilities derived from some form of superhuman ability, rather than the systematic removal of self-imposed restrictions. Others dismissed the entire incident as elaborate deception, insisting that no individual could possibly achieve what had been demonstrated. They preferred to believe in technological trickery or sensor malfunction, rather than confront the possibility that their understanding of limitation itself might be fundamentally flawed. But a very few, began to ask different questions. Instead of seeking to explain away what they had witnessed, they began to explore the possibility that Sarah had been telling the truth. They began to examine their own accepted limitations with new eyes, to question whether boundaries they had always assumed to be permanent might actually be voluntary restrictions. These individuals would form the nucleus of what would later become known as the Transcendence Movement, beings from multiple species who had learned to apply human philosophical principles to their own development. They would discover that the techniques Sarah had demonstrated were indeed teachable, that the systematic removal of self-imposed limitations could be achieved through proper understanding and sufficient will. But that is a story for another time, another report, another incident that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. For now, the wreckage of Training Facility Omega 7 served as a monument to a simple truth that every sentient being would eventually have to confront. The greatest enemy any individual would ever face was not some external threat, but the small voice inside themselves that whispered, "This is impossible." Sarah Chan had proven that this voice was a liar. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has learned that destruction and creation are simply different names for the same fundamental process of transformation. In accepting the death of his limitations, he achieves the birth of his true potential. And in a universe where such transformations are possible, where accepted boundaries can be dissolved through will and understanding, the only permanent limitation is the choice to accept limitations as permanent. The laughter had stopped, the wreckage remained, and somewhere in the corridors of Kepler Station, a small human woman walked quietly toward her next destination, carrying with her the knowledge that would eventually transform not just humanity, but every species brave enough to question their own assumptions about what was possible. The training deck had cracked in half, but what it had revealed was infinitely more valuable than what it had destroyed. The understanding that strength is not something you possess, but something you choose to accept or transcend. In the end, that may be the most human truth of all. End of document classification level, priority alpha distribution. Senior command only filed by Commander Veltar Gis, Tactical Assessment Division, date Galactic Standard 2387.156, status under review, implications assessment ongoing. The greatest victory is not the defeat of external enemies, but the conquest of internal limitations. What we witnessed in Training Facility Omega 7 was not superhuman achievement, but human achievement freed from the restrictions of superhuman assumptions about what humans can achieve. The investigation continues.